The Pacific in mid-1942 was a battlefield stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. A war fought not just by armies, but by distance, fuel, and willpower. After the shock of Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines, the Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable. Its navy ruled the Western Pacific, its troops occupied vast swaths of Asia, and its commanders were confident that the Americans had neither the skill nor the resolve to push them back. Then came Midway. In June 1942, 4 Japanese carriers were sunk in a single stunning engagement. The victory gave the United States breathing room, but only barely. Japan still held immense territory, and its industrial and logistical systems remained intact. Both sides understood that the next decisive point would not be about pride or vengeance. It would be about supply lines. Whoever controlled the shipping lanes of the South Pacific would control the future of the war. That struggle found its crucible on a small, humid island few Americans had ever heard of, Guadalcanal. Situated in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal was of little importance to the world before 1942, but to the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the key to securing their southern flank. In July that year, they began constructing an airfield on its northern coast, and a project intended to extend Japanese air power deep into the Coral Sea and threaten the supply routes to Australia. The United States could not allow that. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal and captured the half-finished airfield. Soon naming it Henderson Field, it became the first major Allied offensive against Japan in World War II, and the first time Japanese forces would have to fight to take back what they had lost. The battle that followed was chaotic, brutal, and relentless. By day, Japanese bombers from Rabaul pounded Henderson Field. By night, the Imperial Navy prowled the surrounding seas, shelling American positions and delivering fresh troops and supplies. These night missions became infamous. Fast Destroyer runs down the slot, the long, narrow channel that separated the islands of the Solomons. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. But despite their speed and skill, the Japanese faced a growing problem: fuel and transport capacity. Destroyers were fast, but they couldn't carry enough food, ammunition, or medical supplies for the thousands of soldiers stranded on Guadalcanal. Japan's logistical command tried to solve the problem by sending large transport convoys, escorted by destroyers, to resupply the island. The risk was enormous. Allied aircraft controlled the skies during the day. Every transport lost meant hundreds of tons of supplies gone, and dozens of sailors with them. But by late 1942, Japan had no choice. Their soldiers on the island were starving, so they gambled. In late November, Japanese command approved one of the largest supply attempts of the campaign: 50 transport vessels, carrying food, ammunition, and replacements for the exhausted troops of the 17th Army. The plan was straightforward: move under cover of darkness, unload before dawn, and escape north before American planes could attack. But the Americans were learning fast. They had radar, speed, and local bases from which to launch small, fast attack craft. These were the patrol torpedo boats, or PT boats, a weapon born from desperation and ingenuity. Each boat was tiny compared to a destroyer. Made of layered mahogany and powered by 3 roaring Packard engines, the PT boat could reach speeds over 40 knots. It carried torpedoes capable of crippling large ships in them, but no armor. Their defense was speed, surprise, and the courage of their crews. By late 1942, dozens of these boats operated from bases at Tulagi and later Rendova, forming the motor torpedo boat squadrons that patrolled the waters around Guadalcanal. Most of their crews were barely in their 20s. They lived in mud, heat, and fear, yet they went out night after night into black seas filled with ships 10 times their size. Their task was simple in orders, but deadly in execution: intercept Japanese convoys, fire torpedoes, and vanish before enemy guns could respond. As Japanese transports prepared to make their fateful run toward Guadalcanal, the stage was set. The Empire was desperate to feed its men. The Americans were determined to starve them out. And in between, under the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound, wooden boats waited, their engines idling, their crews silent. The next chapter of the Pacific War was about to unfold in those restless, deadly waters. By the end of November 1942, The waters around Guadalcanal had become a graveyard. The sailors called it Iron Bottom Sound, named for the countless wrecks that lay beneath its dark surface. Japanese destroyers, American cruisers, merchant ships, and transports, all claimed by the bitter struggle for a single island. On those nights, the air was never still. Engines roared across the channel. Gunfire echoed between the islands, and flares lit the horizon with ghostly orange light. The jungle along Guadalcanal's shore trembled with the concussion of naval guns. It was a war fought in shadows where radar screens and human nerves decided who lived and who burned. For the U.S. Navy, it was a new kind of battle. Their traditional surface fleets were too large and too slow to maneuver in the narrow, reef-filled waters of the Solomons. So they turned to smaller weapons, the PT boats, agile craft that could slip between islands, strike, and disappear. They were operated by the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadrons, or MTB-RONs. Each squadron contained a handful of 80-foot vessels powered by 3 Packard V-12 engines, the same kind used in P-51 Mustangs. Each engine produced 200 horsepower, propelling the wooden hulls to blistering speeds. They were armed with 4 torpedoes, 2 50-caliber machine guns on rotating mounts, and sometimes a 20mm Oerlikon cannon on the stern. But speed and firepower came at a price. There was no armor. A single shell could tear through the hull like paper. Gasoline tanks sat exposed, and one hit could turn a PT boat into a burning torch on the water. The men who served aboard them were volunteers, restless, daring, and often reckless. Many were barely out of high school. Some were former athletes or college students drawn to the promise of speed and adventure. They slept in tents on muddy islands, ate cold rations, and fought in tropical heat thick with mosquitoes and disease. Malaria struck almost everyone at some point. Supplies were short. Engines broke constantly. Salt water corroded everything it touched. Yet the men endured. They gave their boats names like Devil's Dream or Hell's Fury, and painted teeth or shark jaws along the bow. They built their own gun mounts, scavenged parts from wrecks, and modified engines for more power. When fuel ran low, they siphoned from aircraft reserves. To the larger warships, they seemed insignificant, toys in a sea of giants. But in the labyrinth of the Solomons, where narrow channels and sudden ambushes defined combat, they were lethal. Their bases were small, improvised, and always close to the front. At Tulagi, just across from Guadalcanal, wooden piers jutted into the lagoon, lined with PT boats waiting under camouflage nets. The men repaired engines by day and went hunting by night, guided by the faint glow of phosphorescence and the flicker of enemy exhausts on the horizon. Radar was scarce, and navigation relied on instinct. Most missions were blind, creeping through black water, scanning for the silhouette of a transport or the rumble of propellers. The Japanese often used no lights at all, relying on speed and discipline to slip past. But every few nights, the PTs would find them. They learned the patterns, the timing of the Tokyo Express, the routes through New Georgia Sound, the places where destroyers slowed to unload supplies. And when they did, the PTs struck like wasps, fast, furious, and gone before the enemy knew what had happened. Still, it was a dangerous game. Japanese destroyers bristled with 5-inch guns and rapid-fire anti-aircraft weapons. One shell could shatter a PT boat to splinters. The men who survived often did so by inches, dodging fire, diving overboard, clinging to debris until dawn. In November 1942, intelligence intercepted Japanese communications about an unusually large supply operation. Reconnaissance confirmed it. 50 transport ships, heavily loaded, would attempt to reach Guadalcanal within 2 weeks. It was the largest convoy Japan had risked since the start of the campaign. If those supplies reached the island, the Japanese 17th Army could continue fighting for months. If they didn't, the garrison would wither, and Guadalcanal would be lost. Every PT boat in the Solomons was ordered to intercept. Tulagi's docks buzzed through the humid night as mechanics refueled, armed, and tested engines. Pilots from Henderson Field stood by for air cover at dawn. The stage was set. In the dark, wooden hulls creaked against their moorings as men climbed aboard, checking torpedoes and tightening grips on machine guns. Somewhere beyond the horizon, 50 enemy transports advanced. Soon, the night would explode into fire and chaos, and that's where the story of courage and destruction begins. In the narrow, deadly waters of Iron Bottom Sound, The war in the Solomons was not fought by fleets alone. It was fought by men, flesh, fear, and instinct tested against metal and fire. To understand the coming battles, we must step closer, into the eyes and hearts of those who lived through them. A PT boat on patrol at night was a world of noise and darkness. The engines screamed so loud that the men could only shout in each other's ears. Spray lashed their faces, blinding them with salt. The air smelled of exhaust and sea, hot, oily, and alive with tension. Most crews numbered 12 to 15 men. They were not seasoned sailors. Many were barely 20. They had volunteered for the motor torpedo boat squadrons because it promised action, something faster, more daring than the monotony of large ship life. What they found instead was exhaustion, heat, and constant danger. Their world was small, 80 feet of wood and gasoline surrounded by black water. When the sun rose, they slept in hammocks strung beneath palm trees or in huts made from scrap. They lived off canned meat, powdered eggs, and coffee so strong it burned the tongue. Their uniforms never stayed dry. Sweat, rain, and salt water soaked everything they owned. Malaria and dysentery spread easily in the humid air. Men shivered with fever one night and went back out on patrol the next. There was no glamour here. Only courage and routine, checking fuel lines, cleaning machine guns, replacing torpedo triggers that often failed in salt water. Every night brought the same ritual. The men would load ammunition, whisper a short prayer, and wait for the order to move out. Once engines roared to life, the world vanished into motion. No lights, no sound but the rumble of power and the hiss of the sea. They knew one mistake, one flash of light could draw enemy guns. They learned to read the sea like a language. A faint glow on the horizon meant a convoy. The sudden reflection of moonlight could mean a destroyer turning. The throb of engines beneath the waves carried through the hull, telling them if the ships ahead were slow transports or warships hunting them, and when they attacked, it all happened fast. The skipper would line up the shot, 2 torpedoes fired from the sides. Then the engine screamed at full throttle as they turned to escape. Tracer fire split the night like molten rain. The men ducked low, holding breath as shells exploded in the water. Some never came back. Others returned with bullet holes stitched through their boats, their comrades gone, their faces hollow with shock. Yet the next night they went again. In those waters, courage was not loud. It was silent. The courage to climb back aboard after watching friends disappear into fire. Across the channel, aboard the Japanese transports and destroyers, another kind of courage took form, one born from duty and desperation. For Japan's naval commanders, Guadalcanal had become an obsession. The Imperial Navy had promised Tokyo a swift victory in the South Pacific. Yet months of fighting had drained men and machines. Fuel reserves were dangerously low. Air superiority had slipped away to American fighters at Henderson Field. Still, the Emperor's army on Guadalcanal demanded supplies. By November 1942, nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers were trapped there, starving. They called it the Island of Death. Rice rations had fallen to a handful per day. Men scavenged roots, snails, and the bark of trees. Thousands were already dead from disease and hunger. Commanders in Rabaul, the main Japanese base in the region, knew the truth. If Guadalcanal fell, Japan would lose its last chance to halt America's advance. So they prepared one final gamble, a massive convoy of 50 transports escorted by destroyers and covered by bombers from Rabaul. They believed speed and discipline could save them. The transports would race down the slot under cover of night, escorted by the elite Kagero-class destroyers, some of the fastest ships afloat. The plan was risky, but there was no alternative. Every ship carried hundreds of tons of ammunition, food, and soldiers. The captains were ordered to reach Guadalcanal at any cost. Many knew they would not return. Japanese naval doctrine placed honor above survival. To retreat or fail was shameful. Many ship captains gave farewell speeches before departure, standing on their decks beneath the rising sun flag. They had faced PT boats before, small, pesky craft that seemed almost laughable against destroyers. But this time the Americans had more boats, better tactics, and radar. The Japanese had no way to know how much deadlier these tiny hunters had become. As the convoy advanced, the men aboard the transports felt the growing unease. They sailed through the black corridors of the Solomons, every island hiding the flash of an unseen engine. Some recalled the eerie sight of tracers dancing over the waves, or the hiss of torpedoes cutting through water. They prayed that this night, the sea would stay silent. The stage was divided between two types of courage, one desperate to deliver, the other determined to destroy. Both sides knew that within days, only one would control the waters around Guadalcanal. And in those dark straits, wooden boats faced steel giants in a battle that would test the limits of speed, luck, and endurance. The next part of this story turns to the machines and minds behind it, the engines that gave the PTs their sting, the tactics that made them invisible, and the leaders who turned chaos into deadly precision. At first glance, a PT boat looked fragile, a sleek, narrow craft made mostly of laminated mahogany, its hull glinting with oil and seawater, but its real weapon was speed. 3 Packard 4M 2500 engines, each with 12 cylinders and superchargers, roared to life like caged thunder. Combined, they produced over 3,600 horsepower, propelling the 80-foot boat to speeds of nearly 45 knots, fast enough to outrun most destroyers in short bursts. They were small enough to hide among islands, fast enough to evade shell fire, and light enough to be repaired with hand tools. What they lacked in armor, they made up for in audacity. Their torpedoes were Mark 8 or Mark 13, each carrying 600 pounds of TNT, enough to tear through the side of a transport or cripple a destroyer. The boats also carried twin 50-caliber machine guns, sometimes augmented with a 20-millimeter cannon, or even makeshift rocket launchers welded to the deck by the crews themselves. Every inch of the PT boat screamed improvisation. Its design evolved daily. Mechanics cut holes for better cooling, adjusted fuel lines, and modified exhausts to reduce the bright trail of sparks that betrayed them at night. Radar was a rare luxury, fitted on only a few boats. Those lucky enough to have it gained a tremendous edge in night detection. A faint blip on a green screen often meant life or death. The rest relied on eyesight and instinct. The PT's hull vibrated constantly, shuddering from the engine's torque. Its wake glowed faintly in the tropical night, and its wooden ribs creaked like bones under pressure. But the crews trusted their machines. They knew that if they could close within 1,000 yards unseen, their torpedoes could turn even a mighty destroyer into a funeral pyre. The Japanese called them devil boats. They were right. The battles of Iron Bottom Sound were not grand naval engagements like Midway or the Coral Sea. They were knife fights in the dark. The Americans learned to use geography as a weapon. The narrow channels between islands, the Slot, Kula Gulf, and Blackett Strait, became ambush zones. PT boats would spread out in lines, engines idling low, watching for the faint shadow of a convoy against the starlit horizon. Communication was by signal lamp or whispered radio. The first contact often came not by sight but by sound, the deep, rhythmic pulse of propellers approaching through the water. Once contact was made, the boats fanned out, trying to cross the path of the enemy at right angles. The lead skipper would fire 2 torpedoes, aiming ahead of the target's bow to account for its speed. There was no second chance. If the enemy spotted them, the night turned into chaos. Japanese destroyers responded with volleys of shells and star shells that burst overhead, bathing the sea in blinding white light. Every second illuminated meant death. The PTs would throttle to full power, zigzagging wildly, their engines howling as tracer rounds tore through the air. The ocean erupted, the sound of engines, machine guns and explosions mixing with the cries of men shouting over the roar. And then, as suddenly as it began, silence returned. Only the hiss of burning fuel and the distant crack of splitting metal remained. It was a brutal, high-stakes game of nerves. The PTs had no armor to absorb mistakes. A wrong turn meant death, yet their hit-and-run tactics worked, not because of overwhelming power, but because they forced the enemy to slow down, scatter, and lose coordination. Each successful ambush delayed Japan's convoys, making daylight attacks by Allied aircraft easier. Every transport sunk was not just a ship lost, it was food, ammunition, and hope torn from the Japanese garrison clinging to life on Guadalcanal. By December, PT skippers had perfected the art of invisibility, using rain squalls, reefs, and even the reflections of lightning to mask their approach. In the pitch-black Pacific, they became phantoms. Behind these operations were men who understood that courage was not enough. Precision was everything. Among the most notable was Lieutenant Commander John D. Bulkley, who had already gained fame in the Philippines for evacuating General MacArthur under fire. He embodied the spirit of the PT force, daring, restless, and relentlessly resourceful. In the Solomons, officers like Bulkley and others trained their men to think like predators. They drilled for hours on torpedo runs, practiced rapid evasion, and insisted on absolute silence during missions. Every man needed to trust his skipper, because one wrong signal could reveal them to destroyers with 10 times their firepower. The command structure of the PT squadrons was small and flexible. Skippers had enormous autonomy. Out at sea, decisions came down to instinct. A flash of light, a faint echo, a split-second call to attack or retreat. Leadership here was not about rank. It was about survival. When boats were hit, nearby crews turned back into gunfire to rescue survivors. When engines failed, mechanics risked working and burning fuel to restart them. And when the odds seemed impossible, the officers reminded their men why they were there: to choke Japan's lifeline and end the nightmare on Guadalcanal. Even the Japanese respected their tenacity. Reports from Rabaul referred to the PTs as mosquito fleets, small, annoying, but capable of inflicting deadly stings that bled the Empire's convoys dry. Every patrol, every torpedo fired, every survivor pulled from the sea added to a growing legend that in the darkest nights of the Pacific, the smallest boats could change the tide of a war. The strategies were set, the engines primed, and the convoys were coming. 50 Japanese transports, escorted by destroyers, began their run south through the slot, confident they could outmaneuver wooden boats in darkness. But the PTs were already waiting, hidden among the islands, their torpedo tubes loaded, their crews silent beneath the stars. The next nights would turn those quiet waters into fire and steel. The first night began without warning. November 28, 1942. The tropical air hung heavy, silent except for the slow churn of waves against coral. Clouds drifted low, blotting out the stars, perfect weather for an ambush. From the base at Tulagi, 12 PT boats idled in formation. Their engines whispered beneath the surf, their crews tense, scanning the black horizon. Radar on one of the lead boats showed faint echoes, moving south at 12 knots. Dozens of them. The Japanese convoy had arrived, 50 transports escorted by destroyers, steaming through the slot toward Guadalcanal. Their decks loaded with soldiers, crates of ammunition, sacks of rice, and the desperate hopes of the 17th Army starving ashore. The PT commanders exchanged brief coded signals. No words, just flashes of red light. Orders passed silently down the line. Intercept, engage, withdraw. The men tightened grips on their weapons. The engines roared to life. Within minutes, the wooden boats were flying across the sea, white spray glowing faintly in the dark. Their wakes shimmered like molten veins on the surface. The convoy loomed ahead, black shadows against blacker water. The first PT boat split formation, fanning out to cross the enemy's path. The lead boat, PT-44, under Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, crept within 1,000 yards before being spotted. Searchlights stabbed out from the Japanese destroyers, long white beams cutting through the dark. The sea erupted. Tracer rounds ripped the night apart, orange streaks slashing through the air. Kelly shouted for full throttle. The boat leapt forward as shells crashed around it, sending geysers of flame and spray skyward. He fired 2 torpedoes. The steel tubes hissed into the water, leaving trails of phosphorescent bubbles as they darted toward the nearest silhouette. A Japanese transport loaded with supplies. Seconds passed. Then impact. A column of fire rose from the ocean. The transport's deck blew open, scattering debris and men into the sea. Flames rolled across the water as gasoline ignited. The night exploded in color, orange, white, and the deep red of burning oil. The rest of the convoy turned in confusion. Destroyers fired wildly into the darkness, trying to find their invisible attackers. PT boats weaved between them like shadows, firing torpedoes, ducking behind waves. Within minutes, 2 more transports were hit. One broke in half and sank within sight of the others. The Japanese escorts reacted with fury. Their guns thundered across the channel, shells landing close enough to rock the small boats off balance. Star shells burst overhead, turning night into day. For a moment, the sea shimmered with silver light, and then Another torpedo struck home. By dawn, 6 Japanese transports burned across Iron Bottom Sound. The first night was a disaster for the Imperial Navy. The following nights turned the waters into a hunting ground. Each sunset brought new orders, new targets, new dangers. PT boats from Tulagi and Rendova rotated constantly, repairing, refueling, then heading back out. Some crews went 3 nights without sleep. Their eyes burned from salt and their hands blistered from gripping hot metal. The Japanese convoy tried to change tactics. Instead of sailing in open formation, they spread out. Smaller groups, faster runs, using destroyers to shield the transports. But that only made them easier to isolate. On December 2nd, PT boats ambushed a cluster of transports near Savo Island. Radar contact at 22:17. 4 boats converged silently from the north. They fired a total of 8 torpedoes in less than a minute, then turned hard to port and vanished into the night. 3 torpedoes hit. 2 transports sank immediately. The third drifted aflame until its ammunition exploded, sending fragments raining down across the water. Survivors clung to rafts illuminated by the fire of their own ship. The Japanese destroyers charged after the attackers, guns flashing. One PT boat, PT-36, was hit amidships and went up in flames. Only 4 men survived. They were pulled from the sea hours later by another PT returning from patrol. Silent, exhausted, faces lit by the glow of burning ships. Even with losses, the Americans pressed harder. By the 5th night, the pattern was clear. Every attempt to run the gauntlet ended in wreckage. The once mighty Tokyo Express had become a series of desperate rescue missions. Allied pilots from Henderson Field began to see the aftermath each morning. Smoldering oil slicks stretching for miles, Japanese lifeboats drifting between pieces of wreckage, and columns of black smoke rising into the humid air. The Japanese persisted, believing that even partial success would keep their forces on Guadalcanal alive. But every transport that burned meant hundreds of men and tons of food lost. Their soldiers on the island began eating roots and leather belts to survive. In those 2 weeks, the PT boats became ghosts, striking, disappearing, returning with stories told in quiet voices, of engines shot to pieces, of torpedoes that missed by feet, of seeing men jump from decks that glowed like molten steel. And through it all, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound filled with wrecks, layer upon layer of metal tombs. The Japanese High Command, stunned by the scale of losses, ordered one final attempt. The last group of transports, guarded by destroyers and air cover, would try to break through. The Americans knew it was coming. They prepared every PT boat still capable of moving, rearmed, refueled, and ready to meet the last convoy. The second week would bring the most brutal, chaotic nights of the entire campaign, where every shot and every decision balanced between survival and annihilation. December 7th, 1942. Exactly 1 year since Pearl Harbor. But this night it was Japan's turn to face the darkness. The last major convoy, 11 transports and 8 destroyers, crept down the slot under moonless skies. Each ship carried men, weapons, and supplies desperately needed to turn the tide on Guadalcanal. Above them, the sky was thick with low clouds masking their movement. They believed the Americans would not see them coming. They were wrong. On Tulagi, the hum of radar cut through the still air. A faint signal appeared on the screens at 22:40 hours. Large formation bearing southeast. The PT flotilla commander gave the order without hesitation. All boats, intercept. Engines roared to life across the small harbor. 13 PT boats slipped into the water, their hulls slicing through waves as they accelerated toward the darkness. The men aboard knew this night would decide everything. Just after midnight near Cape Esperance, the two forces met. The sea was ink black, the wind almost calm. Visibility, less than a mile. The Japanese formation advanced in perfect discipline, destroyers flanking the transports. But the moment the lead ship's searchlight swept the water, a single streak of phosphorescent wake appeared. A torpedo, cutting straight toward them. Impact. A deafening explosion tore open the side of the Nakomaru, a transport filled with ammunition. The ship erupted into a fireball that lit the entire sea like daylight. The PT boats attacked from every direction, using the burning ship as their cover. Torpedoes streaked through the glowing water. Some missed, but others struck home. Within 10 minutes, 2 more transports were hit. Men could be seen diving overboard as secondary explosions ripped their hulls apart. The destroyers opened fire, their 5-inch guns thundering across the night. Tracer shells hissed through the air, slamming into the waves just yards from the PT boats. PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant Henry Brandt, darted between destroyers at full throttle, firing its torpedoes and then banking sharply to avoid return fire. Machine gun rounds shredded its deck, killing 1 crewman instantly. The boat barely escaped into the shadows. Each PT crew fought in bursts. Strike, evade, reload, strike again. They moved like predators in the dark, guided only by instinct, radar, and flashes of fire. By Zotu 4 Japanese transports were burning. The destroyers, realizing they could not save the convoy, shifted from escort to rescue, pulling survivors from the flaming wrecks even as shells continued to land nearby. But the PTs weren't done. 2 more boats circled wide, cutting off the southern escape route. They waited in silence until the remaining transports passed. Then they attacked. 2 torpedoes hit the Kinugawa Maru. The first exploded in her bow, the second near her engine room. She slowed, listing to port, still trying to make shore. Her captain ordered full speed ahead, straight toward Guadalcanal's beaches. The ship ran aground deliberately, smoke pouring from its hull. The crew scrambled ashore under the faint light of dawn. They had failed to deliver their cargo intact, but they had survived. That morning, Allied aircraft from Henderson Field struck what was left. Dive bombers swooped down, releasing bombs on the burning hulks still visible along the coast. One by one, the last Japanese transports disappeared beneath plumes of smoke and flame. In 2 weeks of fighting, the numbers told the story. 50 Japanese transports sent, 38 destroyed, tens of thousands of tons of supplies lost, thousands of men drowned or burned. The Imperial Navy had suffered one of its worst logistical disasters of the war. The sea between Savo and Guadalcanal, now thick with wreckage and oil, earned a grim new name from the men who fought there: Iron Bottom Sound. The PT crews, exhausted and deafened from 2 weeks of constant combat, returned to Tulagi to find their base barely functional. Many boats were riddled with bullet holes, engines leaking, torpedo tubes empty. The men themselves, gaunt, sleepless, their skin blistered from salt and heat, had changed. They had seen what few would ever witness: the destruction of an entire fleet at close range. By mid-December, the Japanese command accepted the inevitable. No more convoys would be sent. Guadalcanal could no longer be reinforced by sea. What remained of the army there would either fight or starve. The PT boats, those fragile wooden craft built for speed rather than endurance, had achieved what larger warships could not. They had cut the enemy's lifeline. The battle for supply had ended. The battle for survival had begun, and from that moment forward, every decision in Tokyo and Rabaul would be colored by the realization that the sea, once their empire's highway, had turned against them. The next phase would not be measured in torpedoes or tonnage, but in hunger, disease, and the slow collapse of Japanese resistance on the island itself. The sun rose over Iron Bottom Sound, its golden light reflecting off the twisted remains of ships that only days before had carried an empire's hopes. The PT boats, anchored nearby, drifted in silence, their decks blackened, their flags torn, their crews too tired to speak. They had won the night. But victory, as they would soon learn, came with its own kind of silence. When dawn broke on December 9, 1942, the sea off Guadalcanal looked like a graveyard. Oil slicks shimmered across miles of gray-green water, broken by drifting debris, lifeboats, planks, charred crates, the occasional floating helmet. Above it all hung a dense haze of smoke rising slowly into the tropical sky. The Japanese called it the Night of the Lost Convoys. To the Americans, it was simply the end of Japan's reach. Every transport that had gone down carried not only men and supplies, but the last real chance to retake Guadalcanal. The Imperial Army, stranded on the island, was left with nothing. No ammunition, no medicine, no food. The supplies that did reach the beaches were mostly ruined, burned, or scattered by explosions. Within days, Japanese troops on the island began dying faster from starvation and disease than from bullets. Malaria swept through the jungle. Dysentery ravaged the camps. Soldiers boiled grass and tree bark for food. Some were found gnawing on leather straps, too weak to stand. Reports from survivors spoke of men collapsing beside empty cooking pots, their bodies too exhausted to bury the dead. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but hunger had reduced their command to desperation. On the other side of the Sound, the PT boat bases were little more than floating wrecks themselves. The victories had come at a cost: boats shredded by shrapnel, engines destroyed by overuse, crews running on hours of sleep across entire weeks. Still, morale was higher than it had ever been. They had proven that even small wooden craft, armed with speed and courage, could cripple the might of the Japanese Navy. The effect on American strategy was immediate. The U.S. Navy, long cautious about using PT boats in major operations, now began to view them as vital tools for coastal warfare. New flotillas were ordered across the South Pacific, to New Guinea, the Solomons, and beyond. For Japan, however, the losses were catastrophic beyond numbers. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who had commanded many of the Tokyo Express operations, sent a bitter report to Rabaul. Enemy small boats have inflicted damage disproportionate to their size. We underestimated their speed and persistence. Tokyo's naval staff, reading the report, realized the logistical war was lost. Without control of the sea, Japan could not feed its armies or sustain its empire. By mid-December, reconnaissance planes over Guadalcanal saw nothing moving along the northern approaches. The once busy waters were silent. The Japanese convoys had vanished. On the island itself, the change was immediate and visible. American troops noticed fewer bombardments from the sea. Air raids lessened. Patrols pushed deeper into jungle positions once fiercely defended. When captured Japanese diaries were translated, they told the same grim story. We wait for ships that will never come. Some units were reduced to 50 men from entire battalions. Commanders rationed food by the spoonful, 1 cup of rice for 3 soldiers. For weeks, the U.S. Marines and Army forces didn't realize the full extent of the collapse. They expected another major counterattack, another night of shelling from destroyers, but none came. The PT boats continued nightly patrols, hunting for any last attempt at reinforcement. They found instead floating wreckage and empty waters. Occasionally, they rescued Japanese sailors clinging to debris, men too weak to resist, their faces hollow, their uniforms stained with oil. These survivors told a consistent story, that of chaos, hunger, and death aboard the transports before they went down. By the end of December, Allied intelligence confirmed it. Japan had lost control of the Guadalcanal supply line. The Imperial Navy's once feared nighttime convoys, the Tokyo Express, were broken. The jungle had consumed the last of its stranded soldiers. What had begun as an island campaign had now become a test of endurance Japan could no longer afford. The PT boat crews, meanwhile, stood watch on the same waters, still vigilant even as the shooting stopped. They knew how fragile victory could be, and how costly every success truly was. As the tide of war began to turn across the Pacific, the story of Guadalcanal's convoys would remain one of courage, exhaustion, and tragedy, none on both sides of the sea. And yet, this was only half the aftermath. The true meaning of those 2 weeks and the strategic, psychological, and moral fallout would echo far beyond the waters of Iron Bottom. Sound the defeat off Guadalcanal sent shockwaves through the Imperial command chain, from the front lines in the Solomons all the way to the Naval High Command in Tokyo. For the first time since 1941, Japan's aura of invincibility had been broken not by a fleet of battleships but by small, wooden boats and the relentless will of exhausted men. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, still the architect of Japan's naval strategy, received the reports with a rare silence. His staff documented the losses: 38 transports, 12 destroyers damaged, and nearly 10,000 troops dead or missing. Supplies meant to sustain the entire Guadalcanal garrison now lay at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. The Emperor was informed days later. The Imperial General Headquarters called it a temporary logistical setback, but those within the Navy knew it was far more. Guadalcanal was bleeding Japan dry, and for the first time they could not stop it. The Army demanded more reinforcements. The Navy said it could no longer deliver them. It was the beginning of a fracture between Japan's 2 great branches of power, one that would deepen with every month of war. For the United States, the impact was equally profound. Guadalcanal had been a gamble, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. The U.S. Navy had fought on the edge of its limits for months, short on ships' fuel and men. The PT boat victories showed that even small, improvised tactics could cripple a superior enemy. American newspapers soon began printing stories about the Mosquito Fleet, the wooden boats that stung Japan's steel convoys to death. Though details were classified, morale across the Allied world soared. For the first time, Americans saw Japan not as an unstoppable force, but as an enemy that could be hunted and beaten. The lessons learned at Iron Bottom Sound reshaped strategy across the Pacific. The U.S. Navy expanded its PT boat program, assigning them to every major island base from the Solomons to New Guinea. Their tactics, fast approach, torpedo ambush, night withdrawal, became a blueprint for coastal warfare. But beyond tactics, the battle revealed something deeper: the power of endurance. For weeks, men on both sides had fought not just the enemy but exhaustion, fear, and nature itself. The jungle, the sea, the disease. They were all equal adversaries. The Americans had survived because they could supply themselves. The Japanese had perished because they could not. It was logistics, not heroism, that determined who lived and who starved. In January 1943, reconnaissance confirmed what many already suspected. The Japanese had begun evacuating Guadalcanal. Under the cover of darkness, destroyers slipped in to extract what was left of their army. Between January 14th and February 7th, roughly 10,000 survivors were pulled off the island. Nearly 20,000 others had been lost. When the last Japanese troops departed, the once mighty army that had invaded Southeast Asia now faced retreat for the first time. The empire's advance had stopped. Guadalcanal was the turning point. From that moment on, Japan would fight defensively, reacting rather than dictating, retreating rather than advancing. For the Americans, it was proof that perseverance and coordination could defeat even a veteran enemy. The island became a symbol, a word whispered among soldiers with reverence and exhaustion. Guadalcanal. It stood for everything the Pacific War would become: brutal, relentless, fought inch by inch across jungles and seas. By early 1943, the wrecks still visible in Iron Bottom Sound were more than reminders of battle. They were memorials. Beneath the waves lay the remains of sailors from both nations, enemies who had died within sight of each other. The sea was calm again, but the silence it carried was heavy. Survivors from the PT squadrons rotated home. Many carried scars, from burns, from shrapnel, from memories that would never leave them. Some had nightmares of flaming ships and men screaming in the dark waters. The Japanese survivors who reached Rabaul were skeletal and silent. Their faces spoke of defeat deeper than any report could describe. They had seen their comrades die, by hunger and fire, watched their empire's strength dissolve into the sea. For both sides, Guadalcanal was not just another battle. It was a reckoning, with exhaustion, pride, and the limits of endurance. The war in the Pacific was far from over. But from this moment forward, the tide had begun to turn, and in the black waters of Iron Bottom Sound, where the wrecks of 50 ships still rested beneath the waves, history itself had marked the cost of that turning point. The flames were gone, the sea was calm, but beneath the surface the silence of the dead waited, whispering of what came next. The story of Guadalcanal's convoys is not just about ships and torpedoes. It is a story of endurance, of how courage, exhaustion, and human will collided on a forgotten stretch of ocean. In just 2 weeks, the Japanese Navy had lost the ability to feed its soldiers and, with it, the capacity to sustain its empire. The men on those transports, the sailors on those PT boats, and the soldiers starving in the jungle all shared one truth. In war, it is not always strength that decides the outcome, but persistence. The Pacific War would rage for nearly 3 more years. Bigger battles would follow: Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, Okinawa. But in many ways, the outcome was decided here, in the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound, when small boats made of wood turned the tide against a steel empire. The wrecks that rest beneath those waters are now quiet. Coral has grown over twisted beams, Fish swim through the skeletal ribs of what were once engines of war. But the silence carries memory of the roar of guns, the smell of burning fuel, and the cries of men who vanished beneath the waves. For Japan, Guadalcanal was the moment when ambition met the limits of reality. For America, it was the moment when uncertainty turned into belief, the first proof that the Pacific could be won. Every survivor carried that truth with him. They learned that war is not won only by technology or firepower, but by endurance, by those willing to hold the line a little longer, even when hope runs thin. When historians speak of Guadalcanal, they often describe it as the island that changed everything. But perhaps it was not the island itself that changed history. It was the sea around it, a sea filled with courage, exhaustion, sacrifice, and silence. The same silence that now drifts over Iron Bottom Sound, where the echoes of that struggle still sleep beneath the waves, marking forever the place where the Pacific began to turn.